Our final panel is going to be on identity, legitimacy, and stigma. So we have four panelists with us today. Unfortunately, Roy Sotheby cannot be with us, but we have four great panelists who will speak on the topic. Glen Kreiner, Caroline Essers, Elco Burg, and Ted Baker. And so we are in excellent hands here. Glen, I'll go ahead and start with you. Talk a little bit about you do interesting work on mental health and stigma, and even some of how that affects entrepreneurs and individuals, and how this is also reduced. So if you could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing on stigma, and as well, then how might a faith lens apply to this, and how might it either help us or how might it stigmatize us?
Yeah, great. First of all, thank you for having me here. Excited to be part of the panel and the conference again. Good to see everybody. And thank you for the previous panelists as well. In terms of mental health stigma, it's a huge issue for the population writ large. So we can kind of talk about mental health stigma generally, and then how do we hone in and talk about an entrepreneurship context, especially with a faith lens. So I have a couple of slides because they're sort of visual things that are easy to convey. So let me show you this first slide. It's a way to think about mental health stigma and the three major ways that we know that it shows up in society. Let me share these. There we go. All right, so the first level is what we call structural stigma. And structural stigma, you can think broadly in society about laws in all kinds of different sectors like housing, employment, various restrictions that might be placed on individuals with mental health challenges, the ways that they can get access to treatment or barriers to treatment. So that's the law, sort of the legal system side of it. But then we can also think about structural stigmas as embedded in various institutions and parts of society. So policies that are in schools, workplaces, healthcare systems, criminal justice systems, et cetera, that are either reinforcing or dismantling stigma. So for example, in the criminal justice system, some counties and states have separate programs for people who are experiencing mental health where they can actually get care and treatment while they're going through the system, as opposed to just putting them into prison and denying them the care that they need. So this is the idea of structural. So in an organization, we can think about whether it's a startup or a huge corporation, the policies and things that are either helping or hindering. Then the second kind is social stigma or public stigma. And these are the different perceptions that we have about people who are going through mental health challenges, substance use disorders, et cetera. And a lot of this varies by culture and subculture perception. So I appreciated the previous panel and having that international lens, because we can think about all kinds of different layers of culture. And then these are also the stereotypes that we put onto people who have mental health challenges. And then this last layer is about the self. So self-stigma, if I'm experiencing a mental illness or mental health challenge, how do I view myself? To what degree do I internalize the messages from structural and public stigma to myself? And does I sort of develop a kind of a why try mentality? So these three levels are important to keep in mind when we're trying to think about mental health for entrepreneurs, because we can see how the various structures in which the entrepreneur is operating might be making it easier or harder for them to address their mental health challenges. So someone might be struggling with mental health, and the barriers in place for treatment need to be addressed. So another way to think about mental health stigma for entrepreneurs is what other facets of the entrepreneur might be interacting with the mental health. So you think about the occupation that they have of entrepreneurship. Sometimes that itself is stigmatized. Oh, do you really have a job? What are you really doing? You're in between jobs, right? The sort of stereotypes that people often layer onto entrepreneurs can interact with the mental health stigma. Or the particular business that they have started might be in a stigmatized or delegitimized industry, et cetera. And then there might be personal qualities about the entrepreneur themselves, other like disabilities or mental health issues, that interact to create more of that stigma. And then from a religious context, again, I really appreciate the previous panel helping us to think about, as we move cultures and move contexts, the different types of religions and faiths that a person might hold might be completely normalized in one culture and stigmatized in another culture. So imagine you're an entrepreneur who's dealing with a mental health challenge, who also is trying to bring their faith into the enterprise, and that faith is stigmatized. So we see the intersectionality of that as the different parts of the person interact. So in terms of the special challenges that the entrepreneur faces, that's one example. Another is the loneliness that we know oftentimes entrepreneurs experience, that they don't feel like they have other people to talk to. Sometimes they might know people really, really well in the enterprise. They've hired family members or friends, like the family businesses that were talked about earlier. But other times it's very lone wolf for the person, and they feel very disconnected, no one to talk with. We also know that entrepreneurs are more likely than the general population to experience serious mental health issues, have certain diagnoses such as ADHD, et cetera. So those are sort of the problem situation, right? So on the part of what you're asking, Brett, about what we can do about it, we want to think about destigmatization and normalization at each of those three levels, right? So we can talk about structural, social, and self, and what we might do to help the entrepreneur. So in terms of the structural part, changing policies, or as that entrepreneur is building the organization and thinking about HR policies and the culture they want to create, they can be very proactive in trying to create a culture, an environment that has policies for eventual employees to get access to the care. And the more that they share their own journey with people and create a safe space for people to talk about their mental health challenges, we know that that helps to destigmatize. And if we think about the process of normalization, if we get people to realize how prevalent mental health issues are, that we know reduces stigma. So one of the false beliefs in society is that mental health conditions are a small issue, only affecting a small part of the population. But we know that's not true. So, 1 in 20 adults will experience a serious mental illness any given year. 1 in 5 will experience a serious mental illness in 1 year, and 1 in 3 will be diagnosed with a mental illness in their lifetime. So the more we understand those numbers, the more we realize it is not an us versus them situation. We're all in the shared boat. So then the last thing I wanted to share, one last little visual slide to help people think about this. We know that as we teach this continuum, it helps to destigmatize mental health. So the idea is, rather than have an us versus them, if we teach this mental health continuum, that every single person is somewhere on this continuum today. And tomorrow or next week or a month from now or a year from now, you could be in a completely different place on the continuum. So on the far left here, positive and healthy. In the middle, maybe less able to deal with stresses. On the right, suffering from severe mental illness. So we know that everyone is here and everyone varies. And the more that we can teach this idea of a shared boat mentality, that helps to destigmatize and normalize. So those are some ways that we can think about addressing it. And the more that individuals and entrepreneurs can connect the work that they do to things that are legitimated already, and normalize mental health, and normalize the things that they do, and normalize faith. If people shared data around how important faith and spirituality and religion are to people, that can also help bust that myth that it's a narrow issue or an every so often kind of issue. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it. I think the continuum idea is helpful, as you say, in terms of mental health. I think it's also helpful in terms of how stigmatized or normalized something is, right? And if we begin to think about it in those terms, it's now, okay, what do we do about that? And how can we do that? And that provides a nice transition to Caroline, who's done lots of work on female entrepreneurship and its intersection with religion. So Caroline, could you talk a little bit about some of the different tactics female entrepreneurs use, particularly in their deconstruction of like the archetype of like white male hero entrepreneur. But how does this religion entrepreneurial identity intersect, and why does that matter?
So thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. And well, it's also very interesting to get to know other people doing great work on this in this field of entrepreneurship and then religion, spirituality. Um, yeah, and you're asking me what kind of tactics, and I'm not sure if I would frame them as tactics. Although, yeah, if we would talk about impression management techniques, one of my PhD students that I'm supervising, who's perhaps also here in the audience, we are really focusing on that as well. But well, I think you're mostly referring to the fact that people always you and me, but also entrepreneurs are doing their jobs, their profession, in this case, entrepreneurship, at the intersection of gender, ethnicity, religion. And as you all, or perhaps some of you know, intersectionality has been coined by Kimberly Granshaw in order to understand the positions of in and exclusion related to all kinds of identity categories of in and exclusion to make sense of minoritized positions and positions of experience of violence, etc., etc. And indeed, religion is one of these. And what I'm particularly interested in is their identity work in relation to identity regulation. And so in the case of the Netherlands, but also perhaps beyond, but mostly in the Netherlands, how do women, indeed empirically then, with a minority migrant background, but also a Muslim background, experience to be enabled, but also disabled to be an entrepreneur? And this all goes back, relates to legitimacy. I think I also heard this concept coming back before. So of course, every entrepreneur has sometimes situationally difficulties, challenges with acquiring a legitimacy. But when you are a woman entrepreneur, and this relates indeed to intersectionality, when you are a migrant woman entrepreneur, and when you are a migrant woman Muslim entrepreneur, so it's all intersect, all on top of these, then it's even more challenging to be seen as a legit, successful entrepreneur. And so the tactics, I would say, they are involved in all kinds of identity strategies, identity work in order to be seen and accepted by different stakeholders. And that's also sometimes quite difficult for the women that I've interviewed in the last uh, 20 years. It almost is a little bit schizophrenic because it's very situational. So at one point, they can, for instance, show their femininity, but in other instances, they cannot. Sometimes they have to interpret they can interpret their Islamic identity individually, sometimes not. So when it comes to Islam, I did some work and I also published this in Human Relations, amongst others. We came together with my colleague Yvonne Benschop we found that they were engaged in basically four types of identity works or boundary works. So one was to situationally resist the idea that working with men, which in some case by the Islamic grassroots was seen as dishonorable and shameful, was in fact respectful and honorable by, for instance, comparing us with being a nurse or something else like that. That was one type of boundary work. The second was to individually interpret and say, okay, yeah, God, Allah, Islam is very important for me as a source of inspiration. So my faith individually really supports my entrepreneurial identity as a woman entrepreneur. But when it becomes dogmatic and when I'm being prescribed by my grassroots or someone else that I have to feel myself or something like that, then so that's another way of putting boundaries. So that's the second one. And then the third one was even, you could say, deploying their and showing their knowledge of Islamic faith, and referring to the first wife of Muhammad, and say, okay, she was a trader, she was the first wife of Muhammad and an entrepreneur. So who can say my religious grassroots that I cannot be a woman entrepreneur? So it's of course very clever, very strategic. And then the final was boundary work was to historicize and to say, okay, perhaps those thoughts that women cannot be professional actors and entrepreneurs, that was perhaps a thought then, but not anymore. So this is very interesting. So how they sometimes use or go around or mold, adjust, resist, adhere to those ideas of a proper, appropriate woman, Muslima and entrepreneur at the same time. Does this give you an answer to your question?
It's fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think the work is so interesting in terms of the way that religion is sort of selectively engaged with, and how they use that as both an identity and identity management or identity work tactic to sort of work through that. That's super
helpful. And I'm now of course only giving some snapshots of my work, but it's so important also when we have, including myself, so stereotypical images of how people with a Muslim background are when we talk about identities or should behave. But there's so much, as you of course also know, diversity within Islam. And some of the women that I interview, some of the Muslim men that I interview, the migrant man, Turkish, Moroccan, they are not Islamic religious at all, but they have to relate themselves because they're being ascribed as a Muslim person, Muslim entrepreneur. So that's also very interesting.
Oh, it's great. Thank you, Caroline.
Okay.
Okay, I want to move over to you and talk a little bit about you do a lot of work around business practices and particularly around care for humans, and that's volunteers and hospital workers and family businesses. But could you talk a little bit about some of the practices there about caring for humans and what entrepreneurs could or should do, but as well, what's the role of faith in that, and how might faith play a role in continuing to understand this practice of caring for humans?
Yeah, thanks, Brett, and thanks for having me on the panel. I really enjoy this conference every year again, and yeah, so it's great to have these conversations, see what's all going on here. I will share a couple of different contexts and studies that I've been engaged in. So, and we'll try to highlight a couple of learnings from that. It's not all related to entrepreneurship, I think, but some is more, let's say, org theory based. First one was a study that I did during COVID, really the start of COVID. So we got invited from the for a project in Amsterdam on the care for migrants, homeless people, sex workers, all the kind of marginalized groups in the city. And the really idea was to see, okay, what's going on and how can care to those vulnerable groups be provided during the crisis, and how is it being? Can we learn anything from it, basically? And one of the biggest players here, and that's probably true in lots of large cities, is the Salvation Army. And the other one is really caring for a lot of homeless people, is what they call the Rainbow Group here. And it's originally from a charismatic church. It's now kind of, they don't really play out their religious background anymore, but the Salvation Army does, of course, but also kind of in a mixed way. What's interesting here is that they reach out to very stigmatized vulnerable groups in a way, especially the migrants. Some of them are what they call unregistered migrants. That means they are illegal. So they look for them, but they are kind of tolerated sometimes not. So they need to move around, and then they try to find them again, because they are illegal. So they will be policed. So it's an interesting thing to see, and I think what you see here is a lot of the religious background comes in, that taking care of humans, whatever type they are. That's kind of, I think, really one of the backbones of Salvation Army. Really, okay, it doesn't matter who you are, what kind of registration you have, if you have any registration at all, it doesn't matter. You're a human being, and we need to care for you if you are in need. So that was, I think, one of the interesting things, and that's kind of cross-cutting the different studies that I do in different settings as well. I typically find this as a core element of religion in general. I think it's kind of, there's some element of resistance against state, elements of resistance against what's going on in the overall environment, and saying, okay, we have other values and they are anyway important, whatever the police wants to do in our city. I think the Salvation Army has also a very interesting structure, because you have this dual structure, like another army. You have a civil side of the Salvation Army, so that's non-religious workers, you could say, and you have the Salvation Army, say the pastors or the people we were part of the church, actually, the Salvation Army Church, and that provides not only difference, it provides a kind of I think resistance against change in some way, and keeping the values, but also it provides an interesting type of resourcefulness, because they often said, okay, and now the state is not paying for this type of service anymore because they think it's not important. Okay, then we move this fund over to the church side, and we still have resources because of our sponsors and our members of the church. So it's always, I think they could do more than other organizations there, because they have different types of resource they could tap into because of their religious background. Moving over to a different setting, we also in the COVID time still, but also in the work I now do in elderly homes, and is that we see when it comes to, for instance, moral dilemmas, people struggling with, okay, what do I do? For instance, during COVID, they had those drug users saying, okay, they're now in lockdown, we can't go anywhere. Who's buying drugs? Are we doing it? Can we do that? Should we do that? Those kind of questions. Then you end up with moral dilemmas. And then you see it's often the religious people, or in this case, the religious pastors running around to say, they kind of become the resort for those questions, because the managers typically, especially during COVID, that say, okay, you're adults, you're professionals, deal with it. We're not going to answer your moral questions. But then they've really felt lost, of course. Well, I'm a professional. I know it's not allowed by law. I know this person needed. I'm not here to kind of get this person from the drugs that you're using. But what should I do? I never bought any drugs myself, so what do I do? But then you see that religious backgrounds probably have a bit of a value there. You still, okay, but you can still talk with me. You can deal with it. I see the same thing in elderly homes, where now it's really, in the Dutch situation, we have a huge shortage of workers in elderly homes. So really, the government is really pushing hard for digitalization of almost everything. So then people get into kind of trouble. Okay, how do I still care for my people? And then I think some of the pastoral workers who run the elderly homes are kind of resistant against those huge technology, let's say, pushes in the elderly home, saying, okay, is this really still a human? Is it still an eye for the human side of the work that we do? So there's a kind of a resistance, I think, in faith here towards some of the tendencies. It might be just some of the changes. Just one other example that this doesn't always pay out. There was just a study being published I think this week, a PhD dissertation on the role of the pastors in the Indonesian independence war. You probably didn't see it, but I think for the Dutch context it's relevant, because of course, it was a war between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And there, actually, the pastors kind of supported the what we now call the it was actually a war against the Netherlands, and I think the Netherlands didn't play a good role in doing that. But there we see a different side, that the pastors went along with the military and said, okay, these are evil militants, you should just go after them, etc. And in hindsight, it was wrong, but at that time we see it. So the question could be, when is religion kind of a sort of resistance against some of the dehumanizing practices, and when is it not? I think that's an interesting question, and maybe also for an entrepreneurship setting, saying, okay, what's the role of religion in resisting some practices that are driven by all of a sudden changes, maybe against some of the values that we had for a long time, and that's then the role of religion. Maybe last study that I would like to mention is a study I did with one of my PhD students in Indonesia, Valetahan. He has studied volunteers in religious organizations, so mostly Islamic faith-based organizations, but also a Catholic one and a Buddhist one. And what we saw there, we focused really on calling, and what we saw there is that this double role, this kind of paradox of calling. So I think that's interesting because we often talk very positive about calling. Well, it increases commitment, and Mitch present the same thing. I think that's overall true. But it's especially maybe among volunteers, it has also a large potential for manipulation. And working with some FBOs myself, I've seen that saying, okay, I think your calling is to do this, or in this case, even volunteers are saying, well, we don't pay anything for you, even not coming here, we don't pay for your gas or whatever, because in the end you will get eternal rewards anyway. So why should we pay you now? It's a very cynical way of putting it, but sometimes, and there's also some of the initiation practices and some of the NGOs who are really pushing towards, okay, you need to be a very committed volunteer, otherwise you don't get your rewards in the end. So we wrote a paper about the paradox of spiritual rewards, that kind of thing. So it's really, I find this as a manipulative strategy towards managing your workforce, especially for those large NGOs that run basically on volunteers. I think that's one of the dark sides of calling that's not so much talked about, but it's quite interesting to see that, and especially if you deal with rather vulnerable volunteers, because they don't have any say in the management of the organization. They often are kind of the workforce you rely on, and well, if they just don't like it, they go. So it's but it's still, they're in a vulnerable position, but it also increases their potential for manipulation there. That's, I think, a couple of things I would like to share. It's not like I have a long list of good practices or bad practices, but just a couple of more, let's say, inductive findings.
No, super helpful. Thank you, Elco. I don't think we're going to talk about the calling of reviewing for journals, but maybe that's the direction it's headed. I don't know.
Just promise some eternal rewards, Brett.
Right. Hey, Ted, let's shift over to your work. You and Jody and Aaron have done this wonderful paper. Could you talk a little bit about religious identities and capitalist identities, and when they come into sort of, I guess, interaction with each other, especially in these African contexts, and talk a little bit about the patterns you guys see in these sort of competing identities and the way those are negotiated.
Yeah, so I want to start out by saying that just like last time I spoke at this conference, I have totally failed to study what it is that I actually find interesting at the intersection of entrepreneurship and religion, which is I would like to study the creation of new religions as a form of entrepreneurship and innovation. And I'm still hoping to find a way to do that. And
you said last time you were going to do it. I was waiting for the big reveal today.
Yeah, I know. So I'm an abject failure in this regard. So if you want me to sign off, I can. So the field of identity theories continue to be both siloed and a highly contested battleground in both social psychology and entrepreneurship. And it's increasingly to me difficult place to sort of tiptoe around. And so I've tried to stay within my own wheelhouse entirely. And when I've found religion and stuff that we've done on entrepreneurship, it wasn't because I was looking for it. It was because we were doing some inductive study and it was thrown in my face, and I had to find some way to try to theorize this myself and my co-authors. And so my interest is typically around how entrepreneurs, so we all have a whole bunch of identities. So I'm going to make some comments at the end about how much I dislike the notion of entrepreneurial identity. We all have a bunch of identities. So we have a bunch of social identities, we have a bunch of role identities. Some of these are transitory, some of them are persistent and so forth. And so the way that Aaron Powell and I have looked at this is that we, rather than say an entrepreneurial identity, we stepped away from this and used the term founder identity. And we see this as the set of identities that's chronically salient to a founder as they go about their day-to-day work. And in most cases, we see that there's numerous identities that are salient to them chronically as they go about their work. Now, this is true anytime anybody says there's intersectionality is way. There's different ways of theorizing intersectionality. We're doing this in terms of identity congruence. We consider two chronically salient identities to be congruent if behaving in accordance with one of them doesn't keep you from behaving in accordance with the other one. And what we've seen is struggles for entrepreneurs in different contexts to find some way to achieve this sort of congruence. So when we studied the textile industry during the Great Recession, when it was already like hemorrhaging in the US South, what we discovered is that in the face of this disruption and the lasting adversity, founders found ways to express their social identities by creating roles and role identities within their businesses that allowed them to act in accordance with their valued social identities. Now, in a study that Aaron and I published in 2014, this is my favorite story that we found about religion and entrepreneurship with identities. It's this guy, Les Eggles, right? And so Les was working for 20 years as a textile and apparel executive in Manhattan. And he increasingly began to believe that as they were shutting down factories in the South and moving them to Central America and destroying communities and people's livelihoods, that this was in conflict with his Christian beliefs. And that he didn't like the fact that they were basically living the high life in Manhattan as they wreaked havoc on these people's lives. So he quit his job, moved back to a town where he'd worked in a factory more than 20 years before, bought the shutdown factory, and reopened it. And he reopened it by going back to the church he'd gone to back when he lived there, getting investors from the church, and found a way to create a business where every day he lived his Christian beliefs, his beliefs in the value of family and community, and as well as his beliefs in the need to make the business an ongoing concern and so forth. And we call this, he created roles for himself that allowed his identities to be fully congruent. What this meant is when the Great Recession happened, he taught this as sort of a challenge. He saw this as a challenge he could counter, right? He was who he wanted to be, right? And he was going to stick with that, and he was going to find some way to work through this. And this guided his life. I have a quote from him here somewhere. Second. This is so we've talked with him dozens of times, but he said, "My wife and I are committed to the business. I mean, our life is dictated by three things: our faith, our business, and our family, and nothing else. Nothing else is important to us. We work hard every day to keep the company healthy. And so Sunday, you'll find us in church. And Monday through Saturday, you'll either find us working or doing something with the family." Fairly simple, right? It was impossible to understand this guy's behavior without taking very seriously his religion, right? And we followed him for several years. And when he decided it was probably time for him to retire and his son wasn't in a position to take over the business, he took a huge hit when he sold the business in order to be able to write in contractually protection for his employees and for the community in which he was doing business. He was at the time, very quietly, the largest American manufacturer of textiles and apparel in the United States, right? So he'd succeeded fairly well. And he was just like, right, there's a right way to behave. And we talk about that in church every Sunday, and that's how I run my business, right? Pretty clear story, right? And so what he did is when he found that his roles and his role identities in Manhattan as a textile executive were in conflict with his social identity as a Christian, he he fixed it by quitting his job and creating an organization in which his roles were congruent with his social identity. Les sticks with me all the time. I mean, I think Aaron talked to him like 132 times or something. I talked to him 6 or 8 times. It's like it was we in the book, a chapter we wrote for Melissa Cardin. It's like we talked about how like he would treat Aaron like she was his daughter and tell her certain things or feel comfortable with things. And if I was there without Aaron, he'd tell me like manly things, like about the financials and stuff like that. It was his fairly traditional guy. More recently, we Jody Delight took on a really ambitious project where she spent 4 years and 6 lengthy visits going to the northernmost county in Kenya, bordering Ethiopia, where she studied pastoralist goat herders in a collectivist community. And she went there because there was an intervention where they were trying to sell, things are getting hotter and drier in northern Kenya, and it's harder for goat herders to survive. And so there's lots of challenges. So an NGO decided that they were going to do an intervention where they would teach some of the people in this community to be capitalist entrepreneurs. And so Jody went up there to study because she and Ralph Heyman sort of study cross-sector partnerships and stuff. And then she started doing this and said, wait a second, the people they're doing the intervention to are way more interested than the organization that's doing the intervention. So she switched and she studied that. And she lived up there. She hung out with people. She had everything recorded and transcribed and translated. And the sort of interesting income or outcome, or the one that we focused on so far, is did people really stick with this new capitalist entrepreneur role, right? People volunteered to become part of the intervention. They did this. They were taught things like how to save money, how to reinvest it, right? They were given tiny bank loans that they were taught to repay. They were taught about profit and loss, which there was no word for this in their language and so forth. And some people stuck with this and other people didn't. Everybody who took this on at first got a really bad response from their neighbors and customers, because this was a collectivist society where people were accustomed to being given things and having things shared. And if somebody needed something, somebody else would give it to you and so forth. And what these individual newly hatched entrepreneurs were being taught was, no. You got to save your money. You got to charge people for things. If you lend them money, you have to charge interest, things like this. And so their customers, not accustomed to being treated as transactional, rebelled. And in the traditional religion that was dominant here, people could curse other people, and the curses would be believed to take effect, to have bad effects on people of various kinds. And so what we found is that the people who started trying out this new role, who held to traditional religious values and believed in the curses, backed off. Right? They said, I'm not doing this anymore. Right? They abandoned the capitalist role. People with Christian religious identities, which were a smaller group, but we don't know how many there were. We didn't do a census, but there seemed to be fewer of them, said, wait a second, God is going to protect me from these curses. Right? I don't worry about people cursing me like this. And they continued adopting and moving toward the capitalist entrepreneur role. And then there was a third group who had traditional religious beliefs, traditional religious social identities, and who, when they first got cursed, said, uh-oh, and started backing off from it, and then came to the belief that social identity is the religious and collectivist social identities and the power of curses only applied in their personal lives. So they compartmentalized their personal lives from their business lives and said, if you're cursing me because of something I'm doing in my business, that can't harm me. So we called them compartmentalizers. And they ended up behaving, as far as we could tell, the same as the Christians, as far as saying, yeah, I'm going to go forward with this, right? I am going to, be a capitalist entrepreneur, despite the fact that people are cursing me because their curses don't affect me in my business activities. I have a couple of other papers that are under review, but some of you could well be the reviewers on them. So I'm not going to say what they are, but if you're getting any papers that have anything about religion and identity, and it sounds like my stuff, you should definitely give it a thumbs up.
Perfect plug at the end. We're sort of up against the clock, but I just want to do sort of one question that sort of encapsulates. But as you think about faith and incorporating a faith identity into the broader identity literature and into the broader entrepreneurship literature, just curious about any particular or unique opportunities or particular unique challenges in trying to do this sort of research.
So I'll even though I just talked, I'll talk again very briefly. I think this is easy. I think once you open your eyes to it, you're finding that this is everywhere you look, right? Most of the people I've studied over the last however many years have been people of faith of some sort. And I somehow mostly didn't notice that or pay any attention to it. And I think so. As some people already know, I'm aghast at the notion of entrepreneurial identity. I think most of what we see written about entrepreneurial identity is based on demand effects. And I've been testing this, right? I have this program where we teach previously incarcerated people to be entrepreneurs. And I can say to them, tell me about your entrepreneurial identity. They've never thought about this before. They can generate one on the spot, right? And it sounds like something that they would have seen on Shark Tank or read about in Silicon Valley, right? It's got nothing to do with an actual identity. And I think we're seeing a lot of this stuff happening, right? The other part of it is it's somehow, right? If you say, oh, that's their entrepreneurial identity, it's like that's the thing that's somehow guiding them in their behavior running an organization. And for the vast majority of entrepreneurs, it's just not true. There's a series of meaningful identities that are shaping what it is. And I think if we allow ourselves to think there's one entrepreneurial identity, that excludes from consideration important other identities like faith and religious-based identities. And I think that that theoretical mistake has kept us from seeing what's really right in our face.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you all. Appreciate your time and appreciate your contributions again to the conference and to the panel. So Glen, Caroline, Elco, Ted, thank you for your time today.